Hello, welcome back. This is Transmedia Storytelling from Mythology to Marvel, Lecture 5. It's Resonant Simple Story Myths. Resonant Simple Story Myths. Resonant Simple Story Myths. What the hell, Resonant Simple Story Myths? It's about as simple as it sounds. The idea here is to tell a story that is, at its simplest, so human, so resonant across multiple cultures, that it's going to, spread. The bigger the intended transmedia story world and desired audience, the simpler, more universally resonant the central simple story should be. All these stories, like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Spider-Man story, with great power comes great responsibility. That's a very human story. Luke Skywalker, the farm boy, going off to save the world, save the universe. That's the kind of story that any kind of culture around the world is going to appreciate, right? So let's break that down a little bit. So Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell is one of the most influential mythologists, anthropologists, cultural scholars, arguably in history. So what Campbell did was he wrote this book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, about the way that stories, especially big mythology, the kind of tales we tell to our young kids, those kinds of stories follow similar patterns no matter what part of the world you're in. And those patterns look something like this. So, the hero's journey begins with an ordinary world, right? The known world, the kind of normal state of affairs. And so we talked about Minority Report in the last lecture, and how the world of Minority Report is built off of a central deviation from reality, right? So what if you could predict the future within a limited amount of time, a limited amount of space? That's the what if. The then what then populates itself across architecture, across transportation, across culture, until it finally gets to that sort of so what that Spielberg was going for. And that so what, asking what are you willing to trade, to live in that degree of security? Would you really want to live in a world where you couldn't be murdered because the pre-crime unit would show up before the crime was ever committed, if it meant that you could also be prosecuted for crimes that you had no intention of committing? And it's that sort of what if moment that so what moment that is frequently embodied by the call to adventure, right? So that's the point where even that alternate future, not alternate future, even that sci-fi future in Minority Report, what if you could predict the future in a limited amount of time and a limited amount of space? It still creates an ordinary world, right? It's not our ordinary world, but it does set up this future scenario in which the pre-crime unit shows up and stops all crime. It's when that breaks that Tom Cruise's character suddenly finds himself, on the run for murdering somebody he'd never even heard of. That's where that story begins, right? I mean, that's where that everything really kind of kicks into gear. So when you look at it that way, there is the initial central deviation from reality, right, which sets up that world as being different from our own. And then there's a second deviation from that reality, which is that sort of inciting incident. So that call to adventure is that moment at the beginning of the story when our hero's ordinary world gets turned topsy-turvy. Sometimes it is extremely clear, where that happens. Sometimes it's not a single event. If you go and you look at the original Star Wars, Star Wars is very, 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 very clearly inspired by the Campbellian model. George Lucas himself has said that a large chunk of the story structure for our Star Wars comes directly out of Campbell's hero's journey. You can actually find some really cool stuff online because Campbell he didn't write that book that long ago, right? And so there's really interesting interviews with Campbell, specifically about the hero's journey in Star Wars, which are really fun to watch. Anyway, so Luke's call to adventure. Some would argue that deviation from his reality of being a moisture farmer on Tatooine comes when the droids show up, right? So when C-3PO and R2-D2, when Uncle Ben and Luke, go get the parts and go get the droids from the Jawas, instead of going to Tashi Station to get some power converters, um, when he first meets R2 and 3PO, is that the call to adventure? Is that first deviation from reality? Maybe. Is it when he first meets Obi-Wan Kenobi? Maybe. Is it when, spoilers, Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru are turned into crispy critters by stormtroopers and he has no recourse? I don't know. So if you look at Campbell's model, it begins with a sort of call to adventure, right? There is some deviation from that character's original reality, and then the hero gets some kind of supernatural aid. This is the kind of mentor figure that starts to show up, and so you could see that supernatural aid as, in this case, Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? So if you see the call to adventure as when that particular moment that R2-D2 plays the video, that hologram of Princess Leia, and says, help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. And Luke says, oh, well, I wonder if she means old Ben Kenobi, and decides to go take him out in the middle of the desert. Go find Ben Kenobi. That is the moment where he starts getting the supernatural aid from Ben Kenobi. And then there's that sort of, this is where things get a little bit confused, because there is what's called the refusal of the call, right? So the hero says, oh, I recognize that that this is interesting, but I can't do that. I've got to help Uncle Ben with the moisture farming next season. Maybe next year I'll go join the Empire, right? And then, crispy critter time, and he has no choice. The Threshold Guardian for Luke's story in this model might be Han Solo. It's that moment where that person first experiences resistance, right? Where they have to overcome some kind of a gatekeeper, in order to get out onto their big adventure. So once Luke crosses that threshold, literally leaving the surface of Tatooine with Han and Chewie and Obi-Wan and 3PO and R2 in order to go off and save the princess. That's where the story really kicks into high gear, right? And that at this stage of the hero's journey, the hero goes through all these different challenges and temptations. There are all these kinds of different trials that Hercules has to overcome, so to speak, right? And as they go along, they find more and more of these kind of mentors, these helper figures, in order to gain the kind of skills or the tools or life lessons that they need in order to, succeed. And so this continues on, and then at some point, the hero hits this moment of the abyss, right? This is that moment where the person that they were before ceases to be. It's a moment of evolution. It's a moment of death of the old and a rebirth into the new. Where this happens in Star Wars is a matter of some debate, depending on what level you look at it. There is one argument that says that this is the moment of Luke's blindness when he is doing the saber training on the Millennium Falcon, and as he starts to learn how to use the Force, as Obi-Wan teaches him how to use the Force, he goes from being blind with the shield over his eyes, right, to really being able to see in a new way in order to use the Force to knock down the training droid. Another argument at a higher level says that moment of death and rebirth comes with the death of Obi-Wan Kenobi, or the death of not the death of, but in Empire Strikes Back when Luke is on Dagobah and he has the new mentor, a new trainer that's trying pushing him even further forward. That moment where he is in the tree and he slashes open that Darth Vader's helmet to see himself there, where he has to face that own deepest fear, right? Where his fear is not of Vader himself, but his fear is that he will become like Vader. Anyway, so he goes through that kind of transformation. He goes through that climax moment. He achieves that revelation, that learning of new truths and things. Goes through these final climax, these big climaxes. This stage of atonement, right, where he's kind of bringing things back into balance. Synthesizing the old with the new, realizing their own power. Going through this big climax where they fight the dragon, kill the dragon, take the dragon's hoard. To completely mangle my metaphors. And then this last stage, when they receive that reward, when they get that, they learn that lesson, they learn how to make fire, right? Then they return back to their village. And the hero at that point brings as the prodigal son, brings the knowledge back to their people, brings the gift of the goddess back to the people, makes the lives better for all the people that were there that they left behind in the village. And so at that stage, then that hero then becomes a mentor for the next generation. Right, so then that next generation of heroes goes out, experiences similar trials and tribulations, has their own set of adventures, comes back with their own learnings, and then brings that back to the civilization and becomes a mentor for the next generation, and the cycle continues over and over and over again. This is why that kind of a story is so primal. It's so very basic. The caveman that goes out and is the first one to successfully kill a saber-toothed tiger and to bring back the secret of tiger balm to their civilization, right? I mean, that is so resonant with every culture around the world that it's one of the reasons why Star Wars, as a very Campbellian monomyth, this is what Campbell called it, this monomyth theory that all these different myths from all these different civilizations follow the same pattern. It's what gives it legs. It's what makes that particular myth travel. So, how do you do this? Well, there's a bunch of different thoughts about that. One is that if you want to scale big, start small, right? So, in the same way that the Star Wars story is in the very first movie is fairly brief, right? I mean, it's a kind of an epic story, but it's nowhere near as big as the whole thing's going to become. You can see the exact same kind of pattern in The Hobbit, right? So The Hobbit began as a children's short story, right? And so the original Hobbit story, never mind what Peter Jackson would do to it later, it was much simpler, and it served in some ways as a kind of pilot or prototype for what that world would turn into with the vast transformation and expansion that happened with the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So, again, lots of people have lots of ideas as to how to take a small story and make it big. We talked about Campbell. Right, this is the hero's journey, the sort of cyclical movement from ordinary worlds, through the call to adventure into the Threshold Guardians, trials and tribulations with different mentors and assistants, going through the abyss, transformation, atonement, and return. Now, this worked, but it could be refined. So Christopher Vogler came up, and he wrote this thing called The Writer's Journey, which took Campbell's original model and expanded it, added a bunch of details to it. So what Vogler identified was that you could kind of break this up into basic dramatic 3-act structure, right? So the first act is the ordinary world. It's where Luke is still getting ready to go out on his journey, right? And so to go through this series of steps, right? So ordinary world, call to adventure, refusal, meeting with a mentor, crossing the threshold, having new tests, meeting new allies, encountering new enemies, approach to that inmost cave. I mean, this gets really pointed with the whole, tree on Dagobah model. Going through the ordeal, seizing the sword, getting that reward, and then going into the road back. The resurrection is the new generation of heroes, and returning with the elixir. Right? So, going from an ordinary world out into the special world of adventure, and then returning into the ordinary world. So that was Campbell's original model. What Vogler did was he said, okay, well, you can sort of abstract that even further. So at the very beginning, the ordinary world, um, your hero has either no awareness of a problem or some limited awareness of a problem. At the beginning of Star Wars, Luke knew about the Empire, but he had no idea how bad things were. By the arrival of C-3PO and R2-D2, R2-D2 showing the video of Princess Leia increased his awareness of the problem, and it was increased even further once he took them to Obi-Wan Kenobi, and through that mentorship of Obi-Wan, he began to learn exactly what was at stake. But then remember, Luke originally turned Obi-Wan down, right? He had that reluctance to change. And his overcoming of that reluctance was certainly facilitated by that crispy critter moment. But through that, and then through meeting Han Solo and Chewie and Mos Eisley, then he was able to commit to that change, to make that transition of his life over from a moisture farmer into a nascent Jedi Knight, right? And then that began the process of experimentation, preparing, going through the big change, the big crises moments, the big fights with Vader, the loss of Obi-Wan, the loss of the mentor, the consequences of that, and finally that kind of going through that abyss of doubt. He's like, I can't do this. I'm not anywhere near ready to do this. But he was still able to rededicate himself to that cause and then go, blow up the Death Star. And through that final attempt at mastery, that is what enabled what enabled Luke to really become, to transcend what he had been and transform into the Jedi Knight that he was destined to be. Now, that's great, right? That is a plot path that is widely accepted. But others have even further ideas as to how that might be refined. Christopher Booker wrote this book, The Seven Basic Plots, which basically says, okay, the hero's journey is one kind of mythic model, but there are others, right? Overcoming the monster is very much the kind of hero's journey, but rags to riches, Annie, that kind of a story, is very clearly not a hero's journey. But it might share similar elements to it, similar three-act structured elements to it, but it's not quite the same story. The quest is very much a hero's journey. Voyage and Return is kind of related. Comedy, not so much. So there are other kind of patterns at play in comedies. Tragedies, Macbeth, it's a classic example of this. Rebirth, all of these kinds. So what Booker is arguing is that there's only 7 basic plots. And every story out there is some version of one of those 7 basic plots. Tobias, Ronald B. Tobias here, said 7's not enough. We could do better than that. There are actually 20 master plots. And so he breaks them down into these 20 different kinds of plots. If you're interested in kind of generating stories, through these kinds of templates, these kinds of archetypes, this is a very good book, to kind of start sparking ideas. But even that's not enough. If you really want to talk about, crazy story ideation, you need to go to this guy. Plotto is the masterwork of this guy, William Wallace Cook, also known as the man who deforested Canada. William Forrest Cook was a dime novelist, right? So when you start looking at the history of mass entertainment, dime novels were, pulp fiction. The whole term pulp fiction comes from this idea of printing books on paper that was low in quality. It was made from paper pulp, right? And they were quick to produce, they were cheap to produce, and as a result, they were also quick to enjoy. And so people would buy these dime novels, by the bushelful. which meant that during this time, sort of pre-television entertainment, this was the equivalent of modern sitcoms. This was like NCIS and other kinds of procedurals. People just hoovered down these kinds of dime novels, and so the demand for these things meant that there's this whole explosion of pop fiction writers. So characters like Edgar Allan Poe. Um, uh, Nuts. The guy that wrote Maltese Falcon. Oh no, Sam Spade was the detective. Blanking on the guy's name. Dashiell Hammett. So these kinds of Edgar Rice Burroughs, Tarzan, all these things are classic Pulp Fiction novels. Anyway, William Wallace Cook cranked them out like nobody else could, right? And so what he did, here we go. In 1910 alone, Cook conjured a staggering 54 nickel novels, or just over one a week, right? And the way that he would do that was to break these story ideas down into these kinds of tropes, right? And so it almost became like a precursor for generative fiction. Generative fiction is sort of this new experimental model with AI, artificial intelligence, being able to read a huge corpus of text and then generate new texts, based on the emergent patterns in those. So what Cook did was he went through a whole bunch of existing stories and kind of took out or pulled out these different kinds of tropes. If you haven't lost an afternoon or an entire weekend going through tvtropes.org, do it. It's a blast. Tropes are basically those ideas that are very recurring across all kinds of stories. So one trope would be the amnesia, right? Another trope is the the long lost brother. Another trope is the long lost twin brother. Different kinds of variations on those sort of things. And so he created this book, Plotto, which was these collections of these kinds of tropes. This was like the proto TV tropes, kind of a website sort of a thing. And then you could basically generate a story virtually by rolling a dice and picking out which of these things from this list and combining them in new and interesting ways, and then using that as the basic narrative structure for what you would crank out as your dime novel for that particular week. And it worked. It worked really well. He wrote so many of these things, so many hundreds of these nickel and dime pulp novels, that even Stephen King, would look at this guy and be like, "Damn, son, nice work," right? So, but if you look at these kinds of formulas, right, and they are formulas, it's gonna fly in the face of what you're usually taught in sort of English classes. But at the same time, what I've found in my work, and I've said this before, is that especially in Hollywood, you want to produce something that's about 80% proven and 20% original, so that it gets around the kind of fear that you run into all the time with Hollywood executives. And the more that you can kind of rely on those sort of 80% proven approaches, it does help with that kind of monomythian approach to ensure that it's going to travel across a larger possible audience. Now, the other way of looking at this is to say, if you start with these kind of formulas, and come up with a bunch of ideas like this that will adhere to these kinds of formulas, think of it like kicking the tires of your world, just like we talked about in the last lecture, where you have multiple characters, moving through that world, that world-centric storytelling approach. If you can create multiple kinds of tropey stories, set in your world, and they feel interesting, there's enough of a differentiation to them, they have enough of an intrigue to them, then you know that you've built a world that has power, right, that could actually serve as a narrative engine to produce all kinds of stories for a decade or more to an incredibly broad audience. So let's go back to that idea of a basic time-tested formula, right? So this is very much like the kind of storytelling, the what if, then what, then what, then what sort of approach. But this is much more of a very basic story formula. So once upon a time there was, and every day, until one day, because of that, until finally, blah, right? So the first part of this is the ordinary world. Once upon a time there was a young boy, and every day he helped his Uncle Moen, with moisture farming, until one day R2 and 3PO show up, blah, 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 right? So you'll notice that kind of formula is exactly what Pixar uses when they construct all of their movies. Um, Once upon a time, there's this widowed fish named Marlin who's extremely protective of his only son Nemo, and every day Marlin warned Nemo of the ocean's dangers and implored him not to swim far away. But of course, Nemo is a little boy, like any little kid, a belligerent little shit. Tells his dad to pound sand, he's going to go do what he wants, right? And I say this with the kind of bitterness that only the father of a 10-year or of an 8-year-old can muster. I digress. So, but that defiance, that deviation from that ordinary world is what sets Marlin off on his journey to go find Nemo, right? So, in an act of defiance, Nemo ignores his father's warnings and swims into the ocean water. Because Nemo did that, because Nemo ignored his father and swam out into ocean waters, he's captured by a diver and ends up in the fish tank of a dentist in Sydney. As a result of Nemo making that choice, Marlin now needs to decide what he's going to do about it. And so, of course, Marlin decides that he's going to go rescue his kid. And so he sets off on this journey to recover Nemo, enlisting the help of other sea creatures along the way. Just like in the hero's journey, he's going to find new mentors, he's going to encounter new enemies, he's going to go through trials and tribulations in order to get to that climactic third part of the story. And in that third part of the story, at the end of the biggest dramatic moment, Marlin and Nemo find each other, reunite, and learn that love depends on trust, right? Okay. You can also go out and find on Khan Academy the actual course that they teach in Pixar about how to tell a story using this model, right? It's slightly more refined than that. So once upon a time, every day, until one day, because of that, until finally, and then they add this other bit at the end. And ever since then, right, which really crystallizes that notion of the moral of the story is, which gets back to the so what in Steven Spielberg's Minority Report storytelling, like we were talking about before. If you're interested in that kind of storytelling, I put the link to that class here at the bottom of the slide. Going back to what we did at the World Building Media Lab, what if, then what, so what? We covered all of this in very fine detail in the last lecture, right? So if you need a recap, go back and rewatch that one. But the biggest point here is it's that human lens, right? It's that human lens that gives your audience a tour of the world that you've built, and using these kinds of story formula as a way to kick the tires of that world is incredibly powerful. So when we did the World Building Media Lab's Dry City project, this is the drinkable water gets privatized in Lagos, Nigeria project, is I told mine as a comic book. And by that act of creating a graphic visual story moving through that world, I had the opportunity to think carefully about the kind of aesthetic of that world, what things would feel like. There is a level of production design that goes into designing any kind of visual storytelling, and comics are one of my favorite media to do this kind of world building because it is relatively fast and cheap and easy to produce. So all of these things that you see here are Photoshop composites, right? So I went out, found a bunch of source material, photoshopped a bunch of stuff together, dropped them into InDesign, and put the text boxes over top of them. You could do the same thing in PowerPoint, right? But by doing that, I was able to create this beat by beat walkthrough of that world, bringing my readers through it to introduce them to the architecture and the mood and the lighting of that kind of a universe. So same thing with Minority Report, right? Minority Report, would bring students, through that kind of a world. Bring movie viewers, through that kind of a world in order to land on the so what moment that Spielberg is going for. So let's kick the tires of this, right? So we're going to refine this model a little more, complicate it just a little more from what Pixar was doing. So once there was a hero who, more than anything, wanted a hero's desire. Until one day, something happens. This is a very great, time-tested, eternity-approved kind of model for storytelling. You come up with a character and you determine what it is that character wants, right? And then you say, okay, one day, something happens that jolts that character out of their ordinary world and starts them on the path to getting what they want. They may choose to go off on that path. The world, something may happen to them that jolts them out of their ordinary world and forces them down that path. Depending on the character, depending on the storyteller, all your mileage may vary. A different kind of so most stories, something happens, right? So if you have once there was a hero who more than anything wanted a hero's desire until one day he got it. It's not a good story, right? Your hero has to experience trials and tribulations. There has to be work involved. There has to be character growth and change involved. And one great way to do that is to introduce an opposing force. Now, we've talked about, or I'm assuming in some of your English classes and literature classes before, you've studied some basics of storytelling types, I guess I should say. So, man versus man, or person versus person is like the kind of hero versus villain approach. You can also do man versus nature, or human versus nature, or human versus themselves, sort of a thing. Or in 2020, human versus technology is sort of the contemporary subclass or variant upon humans versus nature. I digress. But for our purposes, right here, once there was a hero, more than anything, wanted hero desire until one day, inciting incident. Unfortunately, villain wanted villain desire, which is in opposition to hero desire. So, under the guidance of a mentor and with the help of Ally 1, Ally 2, and Ally 3, they set out to action. But then they discover that setback, escalation of stakes. Something happens, things get more exciting. So they set out to escalating action, do something more, until finally they climax, and achieve some kind of resolution, right? Very basic formula, very super basic formula. But what you realize is that once you start running, different kinds of variables through this system, then you start having very recognizable stories start to emerge from that. So, for example, let's try this out. Once there was a restless farm boy who more than anything wanted to see the world and fight back against the evil ruler until one day the rebels come to the hero's home. Unfortunately, the evil ruler wanted to destroy its enemies and rule everyone forever. So under the guidance of an elderly warrior and with the help of a charming rogue, a giant beast, and 2 jesters, they set out to rescue the kidnapped princess. But then they discovered that the villain is about to become unstoppable. Oh no! So they set out to stop the villain's plan until finally they destroy the villain's stronghold and save the world. This is, of course, Star Wars, right? Try it again. Once there was a normal girl who more than anything wanted a normal life until one day she discovered her secret destiny. Unfortunately, monsters wanted to kill her and all her friends. Oh no! So under the guidance of a wise scholar and with the help of a genius, a good monster, and a jester, they set out to kill the monsters. But then they discovered there's an even bigger monster pulling the strings. Oh no! So they set out to find the ultimate monster until finally they kill the ultimate monster and return victorious to a mostly normal life. This is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Right? You go through and you look at all these different variables and you start to say, oh, okay, I see what you're doing with vampires. I see what you're doing with mentor figures with Giles and her friends Xander and Willow, right? Xander being the jester, and Willow being the genius, Giles being the wise scholar, right? And set out to kill vampires. So their relatively normal life is a new ordinary world where Buffy is a vampire slayer, and every subsequent episode and every subsequent season of that show has some divergence from that ordinary world. Having Buffy just go out and stake a bunch of vampires out in the graveyards of Sunnydale, that's not a story, that's her ordinary world at that point, right? And so as this world evolves over time, though the stories build up upon each other and they get more and more complicated so that every story moves Buffy's super story forward. Let's do this again. Once there was a quiet man who more than anything wanted to be left alone until one day he discovered a special object. Unfortunately, an ancient evil wanted the special object, so under the guidance of a great wizard with the help of a deposed ruler, the hero's best friend, and 2 rival warriors, they set out to stop the ancient evil. But then they discovered that the special object is cursed and is killing the hero. So they set out to destroy the special object until finally they destroy it and render the ancient evil powerless and restore the rightful ruler of the land. This is, of course, Lord of the Rings. Right? one more time. Once there was a wealthy playboy who more than anything wanted to live happily with his family until one day villains kill his family. Unfortunately, criminals wanted to spread chaos, so under the guidance of a shadowy genius and with the help of the law, the hero's surrogate father, and the hero's surrogate children, they set out to restore order. But then they discovered that the mentor is the real villain, so they set out to restore order until finally they outsmart and exile the villain and restore peace and order to the land. And there was much rejoicing. This is, of course, Batman, right? But which Batman? So this is very clearly the plot of Batman Begins, but it also draws off of other elements of the Batman mythos. So when we start talking about the surrogate children of Batman, we start talking about Robin and Batgirl and Red Hood and all these other kind of characters, which do not, of course, show up in Batman Begins. For the most part, they don't even show up in the entire Christopher Nolan trilogy. So when you start looking at this as a recognizable version of Batman, what you're seeing is a kind of what's called an text, right? Or a super text, a narrative structure that is cobbled together out of multiple versions of that particular story that are frequently told across multiple media. This is what the authors mean when Roberto Pearson and William Uricchio, and then later Pearson, Uricchio, and Will Brooker created these books, The Many Lives of the Batman and Many More Lives of the Batman. And the point that they make is that the original vision of Batman was created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, but all those different attributes of Batman that we would now recognize as part of the Batman mythos, things like Commissioner Gordon, the bat signal up in the sky, Joker, Riddler, Bane. Bane is a very relatively new addition to the Batman universe, even though we've seen multiple versions of him over the years now. These are all additions by multiple authors, which means that Batman is himself transauthorial. Same thing with Zelda. There's different versions of Zelda, all accrue different aspects to make up this sort of Zelda-ness that we talked about here a couple of bits ago. So what I want you to do now is I want you to do this exercise. On the Moodle, I have uploaded a file called the Story Spark Generator. It's an Excel spreadsheet. And what you're going to do is you're going to open that Excel file and take out like a 12-sided die, or go to a website that lets you generate a 12-sided die. And what you'll see on the first half of that Excel spreadsheet are like 6 rows that are pre-populated with the different variables from the Star Wars and Batman and Buffy the Vampire Slayer and so on, examples that I've already given you here in this lecture. So you're going to take the die, you're going to take a blank version of that story, right, of that story template, and when you roll the die, if you get one of those variables from a different story world, right, so if you land on one of those, the rows, so you roll a 3, and that's you go to row 3 for the first column, and you pull out that variable from one of those other stories, right, you put that in your own new one. So on the bottom of the document, you'll find blank areas to start filling in your own stories. So you're going to basically play Mad Libs a little bit, by pulling these kinds of things out, by rolling the dice, seeing what the dice gives you, what number the dice gives you, look on the chart, and if it's one of the first couple that are populated, you take that variable out and you put it down at the bottom. If you land on a blank, you can put in whatever you want, right? So say you land on row 8 and there's nothing in row 8, and for my hero, I will say a disaffected, bitter old soldier, right? You will notice that your instinct might be to put in something silly, right? Like a one-legged cheese farmer. Don't put in a one-legged cheese farmer. Don't be silly in this exercise. The whole point here is to come up with a bunch of programmatically generated examples that will help you kick the tires of your story world, right? So if you put in silly stuff, it's like garbage in, garbage out. If you put in silly examples, then you're going to get silly stuff back out. But if you put in serious stuff, things that are versions that could, or particular types of characters or ideas for monsters and things that come out of the story world that you're building, right? Ideas that you've got, then you can start to say, okay, this is starting to feel plausible. So Land on a blank cell phone with your own idea. Plausible is better than funny or absurd. Once you've completed a round, create a fresh copy of the template and repeat the process of rolling the die to populate all the variables. So basically, you want to do this exercise a couple of times. There's going to be a couple of blank rows at the bottom of the big spreadsheet. Keep doing the exercise until you fill them in. Okay? Now, what you should be doing here as you go through this process with your team is to be getting ideas. So some of these randomly generated things, some of these are going to be garbage, right? Some of these are just going to be utterly absurd, but some of them might work, right? Um, by the time you get to the end of this, you should have at least the first inkling of a version of this template, the version of this templated story that might work as the central story for your own particular story world, right? So the idea that it might, so what the dice generates might not be perfect, but it might be 70% perfect. It might even be like 20% perfect. But you might have some idea of like, oh, what about this? What about that? And so together, you should be able to cobble together some version of this story, some version of this template story that you can start to work off of. Okay, so that's what your big goal is here. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to. I forgot to change the 110 thing down there. So yeah, this is your assignment. Go run through the variables. Go run through those stories, and we will come back together again and talk about it in class on Tuesday. So I can't wait to hear what your best story ideas were. What some of, maybe what some of your funniest were. What some of your darkest and most terrifying were. But yeah, so I look forward to seeing what you got. So thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.